and we're ready to move on to theme number 2. All right, guys, what are we going to be talking about this week? This week, we decided to talk about everything miniature, minis. We're going to be talking about mini quilts today, and mini quilts or mini projects. So you're going to see a little bit of both. You'll see some pin cushions thrown in here this week. I'm going to be doing probably like a little cute little sunglass case tomorrow. So they're all like miniature projects, which will be kind of fun. And they're all done on the sewing machine. So today, what I thought I would do is I'm going to start out the week by kind of laying the groundwork. Okay? Tamara says many or mini? Mini. There you go. Mini. There's many. Okay. So today I'm going to lay the groundwork for how do we work with smaller fabrics, smaller pieces of fabric, I should say. So I have 10, count them, 10 tips for you today that I'm going to share. We're going to talk about each one. And then after that, I'm done with that, I'm going to show you how you prepare a single fold binding. Okay. Why is that important? Because if you have a miniature quilt, you may want to reconsider doing a double fold binding, which is what we're used to. Most quilters use the double fold binding method, which works wonderful still. But if you want something a lot flatter, a lot thinner, today I'm going to talk about single fold binding, and it is, when we bring our ends together, it is a little different than what we normally do with double fold binding. So stay tuned, because one of these days you're going to wish that you had remembered, what did she do to do the single fold binding? Okay, so that's kind of what we're going to cover over the next, we have another 35-ish, 40 minutes. Okay, shall we get started? All right, so first things first, here's the question. What is considered a mini quilt? I don't know. I mean, I have my own definition of a mini quilt, and you probably do too. So a mini quilt, I would say most oftentimes is about considered like 24 inches around or less. Some even go as like 6 inches as a mini quilt. I've seen them all, right? I'm going to show you a couple of examples today, but before I do that, let me share with you a few that I found on All People Quilt. I like this one because, guess what? That is a bow tie block. Remember we talked about that, what was it? Was it last week we did it, or the week before? I've been the week before. I'm losing track. But the bow tie quilt, that is a bow tie quilt mini. Very cute. Here's another one. Beautiful. Lots of small pieces, right? You can do traditional, but you can also do a little bit more modern and bright. A mini doesn't have to be a certain colorway. It doesn't have to be a certain style. It's just miniature. And miniature has its challenges, but a lot of people love the challenge. Now, this is a mini quilt, but it could be considered a larger quilt, obviously, depending on what size you make those blocks, right? I love this one. First of all, I'm a huge fan of solids, right? That's gorgeous to me. And I'm even more of a fan of straight line quilting like that. I just love the look of that. All right, here's another example that I found on All People Quilt of a miniature. Okay, lots of little pieces. This one I thought was interesting because they've taken more of a traditional block. You've got the block here is called Broken Dishes. And the setting, though, is a little bit more of a modern flair. So they've kind of mixed something that's a little more contemporary with a very traditional block. So I kind of fell in love with that one. like, ooh, I might have to make that. And then, of course, it could be mini quilts can have like piecing, but also applique. A lot of people will consider even like mug rugs to be a miniature quilt, right? Makes sense. So, yeah, it definitely could be both. Now, before this morning, I was getting my demo ready for you. And I thought, oh, I don't have time to sew a mini quilt. I'm going to go through some of my UFOs. Yeah, I got them. I got lots of them. And I thought, I'm going to find some blocks that are UFOs and make a decision. Do I really want to show, or excuse me, do I really want to finish that as a big giant quilt, or am I good with saying, you know what, I'm going to move forward, right? So here we go. This was a block I had done. I don't even remember. It was probably like 8 years ago, you guys. Now, it was only the block itself. In fact, I've got a bunch of them. Look. There was an exchange at a quilt guild I was a part of, and I got all these. Look how pretty that is. I've got all these blocks. You guys, seriously, I don't think I'm ever going to finish this. I don't know, maybe. I've got enough that I could probably even do like a table runner or something if I wanted to, but most likely, these are all batiks, by the way. Most likely I'm not. I'm just saying, I got to be realistic with myself. Kris is being realistic and saying it's probably not going to happen. So I said, Kris, I had a conversation with myself. Kris, you need to think about this again. Kris, it's okay to move on. Does anyone else do that? Sometimes we have to have conversations and be realistic. So I took one of my blocks and I said, okay, now I got this. I'm going to quilt it. Shauna says, send the blocks to me and I'll use them. You know what, Shauna? I will do that because you're my friend and I know you will finish it and I know you'll turn it into a good cause. So I will send it to you. Okay. Next time I'm in Sandy. All right. So I took one and I said, I'm going to make this into a mug rug or a mug mat. So would this be considered mini? Absolutely. The pieces are not necessarily miniature. Now you can go a lot smaller, right? But this is still would be considered a miniature quilt. So look at that. Isn't that pretty? I ended up putting some batting, which would be another thing I want to mention real quick. Miniature quilts, you want to use very thin batting. This is the Kimberbell Project batting, which I'm a huge fan of. So that's what I used. Some people will choose to use like even flannel for a batting for a miniature quilt because you do not want loft. No loft, all right? So here we go. I used that batting. I just did some cross hatching just on my sewing machine, and I used a single fold binding, which I'm going to talk about later on. Okay, here's another mini quilt I have in my room. Whoops, there we go. So these pieces are actually much, much smaller. And there we go. But it's a little bit larger quilt. All right, so those are just a couple. All righty. Then Kris had another talk with herself. Kris, about 6 years ago, I think, I had started the Lori Holt Cozy Christmas. Does anyone remember this block? Oh my goodness, darn cutest quilt I've ever seen. Darling, okay? But I had one block done. And I said, you know what, Kris? That ain't going to happen. You're not going to do it. So that's okay. So I ended up quilting it today. And I'm going to show you on this one how I do the single fold binding. All right. Let me share my tips with you. I don't have this as a printable, so if you have a notebook and you want to take notes, this is your time to grab a pen and paper and let's take some notes. Let's have a discussion, shall we? Okay, first of all, tip number 1, choose fabric prints that are smaller in scale. I think it kind of goes without saying, right? You don't have as much space, so you got to go smaller. If you're trying to get a large print on there, you're not going to see it. It's going to be cut up, right? Let me show you an example. If I were to do this again, this almost to me is a little bit too big of a print, where this is nice and small. I like that size. Okay, this may be just a little too big. It's not terrible, but there's a couple things going on here. 1, the print. 2, maybe too many colors in that fabric. So when you have too many colors with a very, very small piece, some of it gets lost, right? Because like this one, for example, you see very, very little blue, where this one, you see a whole lot more blue. So it gets a little lost. Think about that, okay? There's no quilt, please. You do what you want to do, but it's a little busy, right? So think about that. Smaller print in scale, and maybe not as many colors. Maybe go towards like a tone on tone would be better for very, very miniature quilts. All right, so that is tip number 1. Tip number 2, starch the fabric before cutting. Now, I don't do this with all of my fabric. If I'm doing larger pieces, I really don't take the time to starch it. Yes, I will iron it out, any folds, wrinkles, stuff like that, but I don't take the time to do it. But especially if I'm going into cutting really small pieces, then I want you to starch it. There's a wonderful product out there called Best Press. There's other products on the market that do a wonderful job too. In fact, another favorite of mine is called Flatter, and Flatter has yummy smells. Oh my goodness, yummy, yummy. But Best Press is a wonderful thing to give it just a little extra body. It gives maybe a little bit more stability towards cutting. If you're going to start cutting, and especially small pieces, starch your fabric before cutting. You'll be much, much happier. All right. Okay, that's tip number 2. Tip number 3, use smaller rulers and smaller mats. Why? Let's talk about that for a second. All right. Sorry, that box. Where did my large ruler go? I don't see where my large one went. Okay. Imagine you have like the 6 by 24 inch ruler, right? That's probably the most common size ruler. Okay. Nice and big. Well, if you're working with small little pieces, what you don't want is that ruler coming and just keep poking you in the belly, right? It's more of a nuisance. So get small rulers, have small rulers. You will be much happier navigating, going around things, cutting things. Use smaller mats so that you can rotate it. I love even the Pink Daily pink rotating mat. Okay, love this because I can turn it, okay, as I cut those pieces out. And especially when you're working with small pieces, oh, you will be so much happier with smaller rulers. All right, hold on. Here you go. Something just fell. Okay. That's tip number 3. If you guys have any comments, I want to hear them, or questions along the way. Christy says she wants that mat. I know, I love it. It's worth it, Christy. It's worth every penny. I love that mat. Okay, here's tip number 4. If available, not all machines come with this, but I want you to select the single hole or the straight stitch needle plate. Did you know that there's more than one needle plate out there? Let me share an example here. Okay. So this is where you saw the rat the rat growing underneath Chris's machine. It's time for Kris to clean that machine out, all that fuzz. Okay, this is your typical needle plate, right? And this is where your feed dogs are, right? But this is a big opening. Now, why do we have that big opening? Well, it's because that way we can move our needle over, you know, by millimeters, and we can move it to the position we want. This is also the needle plate you want when you're doing zigzag stitching or blanket stitching or any kind of character stitching, okay? So that is really important to have that. But let me tell you what will sometimes happen is that because that is open like that, have you ever had fabric that you were putting through the machine? All right. And especially when it comes to small pieces, and it starts to pull, like your fabric gets caught into there. Well, this may be one of the reasons, is because you have too many feed dogs that are open to that area where the needle's going through. So if you have this on your machine, or if you're able to purchase one for your machine, then this is my favorite needle plate. And when it comes to piecing, and that is this, what would be called, some people call it the single hole or the straight stitch needle plate. Yes, Lynn said at points too. Yeah, your points will sometimes get sucked down into there as well. But you can see this is the only place where the needle can go. So you can see the differences here. You've got one that's wider and then one that's single. Your single is going to be the needle plate that you want to put on when you're doing small piecing, if you're able to. All right. Let's see. Now, with that being said, here's another thing to make note of. You could choose the 1/4 inch foot. Now, if you see that 1/4 inch foot here, this has a nice little edge, kind of like a lip right there that your fabric rides on. But look at that, you've got a single hole. You compare that to like the kind of the foot that is the default, and you've got a much larger space here. So I recommend using a 1/4 inch foot along with this single stitch needle plate. All right. Now you could use this and move your needle over, but if you do that, you better use the needle plate that is open, or else guess what? Broken needle, right? Because it's going to hit it. So there you go. A lot of machines will actually not even allow you to do it. It recognizes that the single stitch needle plate is on, so it won't even give you that option of moving the needle over. But there's always that possibility too. So do that. Now, I would also recommend you rechecking your 1/4 inch seam allowance often, especially after the first one. I would check and recheck just to make sure that your 1/4 inch is exact. Now, if your points aren't matching up, if the seams are too big, you may need to go to even a scant 1/4 inch. All right, so scant 1/4 inch, you're not going to be able to use a single stitch needle plate either. So you've got to just remember that. Scant 1/4 inch is just a titch less, or excuse me, a titch, yes, less than the 1/4 inch. All right, gives that room for the thread to do its job and the fabric to fold over. All right, so I hope I didn't confuse you there, but single stitch needle plate is awesome. 1/4 inch foot is awesome as well. All right. Lynn, you do use the 1/4 inch and move needle to the scant. It can work on some machines, some it cannot. Just be careful if you do that you're going in tiny little millimeters, tiny, very little, tiny increments. Like on my Janome machine, I think I have like 87 different stitch needle positions. So that would, yeah, tiny, tiny, tiny. But before I would press the foot down, you know what I would do first to just double check? I would turn that hand wheel towards me to make sure it wasn't going to hit the needle. All right. Okay, so that's tip number 5. 5 more tips. Tip number 6. Shorten your stitch length on a machine. Okay, very important. Your default is usually like at a 2.0 or maybe a 2.5. I would take it down to like a 1.8. Why? Well, if you think about it, when you're stitching and it's tiny, now this is a fairly big piece, I would use the 2.0. But if I was doing like maybe a 1/2 inch or a 1 inch piece, you need as many stitches as you can possibly get so that there's less ability for it to open up at the end. Okay, so shorten your stitch length, tiny stitches. Yes, it makes it a pain to pull out if you have to, but I promise you it makes a difference. So shorten your stitch length when doing mini or miniature quilts. Tip number 7, use leaders and enders if needed. Have you heard of that? I bet many of you have, but if you haven't, here's an example. In fact, let me pull this down so I can try to do it in front of you. All right, so let's say I'm putting these 2 pieces of fabric together and I'm just going to stitch right along here. Rather than starting right here and then the chances of it opening up at the very end are greater. But if I use what you call a leader or an ender, and here's another important thing. When I use leaders and enders, I always fold them in half so that it simulates 2 layers of fabric, just like the 2 layers of fabric that I'm about to sew. Sometimes people will just do a single layer of fabric. I prefer having it simulate exactly what's going to happen on this one. So I just simply fold it over. I start here and I just stitch and then I just continue to stitch. I'm like chain piecing this. And at the end, so this is stitching and my ender, I'll put in another piece, fold it over. These are just scraps usually, and I just go off the end. That way it ensures a couple things. One, my fabric won't get caught down into the feed dogs when I'm starting, or the corners won't either. And 2, that this is not going to come apart once I cut everything and I start pressing. Has that ever happened to you guys? Where at the very end, the thread just starts to come undone? Okay, this will help prevent that. All right. All right. Woo, are you still with me? I hope this is interesting to you. I don't know how interesting this is, but tip number 8, use a stiletto. Ding, 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 ding. We love these, don't we? There's lots of stilettos out there. My favorite happens to be the by Annie stiletto, but any stiletto will do. Even like an orange stick, that you use for a manicure, that can work as well. It's like having a third hand. So let's go back down. Let's say I'm going to the sewing machine. This allows me to continue feeding it through, and then I just push this just ever so gently, and it gets it nice and straight. Because if you've ever been piecing and then do you ever like veer off towards the end? Sometimes that happens, right? But having a stiletto will keep things nice and smooth and consistent when you're stitching. All right, so stiletto you will find very helpful. Okay. All right, number 9. Open seams, open sesame as much as possible. Why is that? Well, especially when you have little pieces, that means you've got a lot of fabric all going in at the same place, right? So which is going to add to a lot of extra bulk. So my tip here is to always wherever possible. It's not my favorite thing to open seams. Some people love it, some people hate it. I'm kind of in between, but I am under the camp of do it when you have lots of little seams coming together, right? Makes sense, right? So I like to press my seams open, and then if you've ever been in my classes before, you guys know how much I love this thing. Have you tried this? This is awesome. Use a Gypsy Clapper to help achieve very flat seams. So let's come down here again. What I'll do is I will stitch, and then I will set my seam with an iron. We're going to pretend that my hand is an iron, and I'm going to open it up, right? And on the back, I'm opening up my seam, and boom, I put heat on there, and guess what I do right after? I just press, I simply place it on top. Now, I could add pressure if I want to, but I have found that it's very easy for me just to put this on top, and then I go to my next one and I stitch that, and I open up those seams, and then I put this on the next one. And by that time, this one's cooled down. I'm ready to go. And then I do another one, stitch it, cut it, whatever I need to do, open up the seam, pretend that's open, put some heat on it, go like this. What does this thing do? Well, this is nothing new in the world of sewing, right? This is what might be referred to as like a tailor's clapper, right? And so tailors would use this to open up their seams. And so it absorbs any moisture and it sets the heat. And the result is really, really flat seams. Again, so important when doing miniature quilts. Love this. All right. It is well worth it. All right. Are we good there? I should be going back and forth and looking at your questions, but let's see. Yay, Lynn says that clapper is a game changer. I'm so glad you love it, Lynn. I do too. Sava loves it as well. True. Brenda, she likes using the folding pin to dampen those seams and ironing. It gets them super flat. Absolutely. I love the folding pin as well, for sure. Okay. So my last and final tip today is to use a single fold binding to finish. Boom, boom, boom. All right, let's talk about it. So let me give you some examples here. Again, with these minis I have. This one has a double fold binding finish, which is, again, what we are most used to as quilters. If you're brand new to quilting, let me explain something real quick. Don't pay attention to the size of this because this is going to be my single fold. But usually with double fold binding, we fold it in half, right, with wrong sides together. Then we add the binding onto the front with a sewing machine, or the back, depending on which is your preference. And then we fold it over again to hand stitch or to use a sewing machine to stitch it down. Okay, that's what I'm referring to as a double fold binding. It's when you cut the strip, fold it in half, then sew it on, then bring it around again. What are the benefits of that? Well, it's definitely stronger. Okay, it's definitely stronger. It has more stability, has more durability, all the things. So if I'm doing like a regular quilt, a bed quilt, a throw quilt, whatever, all day long, I am going to do double fold binding, right? Has more strength. However, if I'm doing a small piece like a miniature, then I will do single fold. Oh, Betty Jo, you even use single fold on your big quilt. Yeah, I don't use single fold on my big quilt just for the fact that it's not as strong. But if that works for you, that's totally fine too, right? So single fold binding is going to be on these smaller things. And you can see, I hope you can see the difference. It's much thinner and it lays much flatter. So if I were to put these two comparatively, do you guys see the difference between those two? So this is going to have a much flatter look to it that just kind of melts right into it from the front and the back. All right, Donna's asking, do I use single fold on my table runners? I don't. I actually do use a double fold on my table runners if it's a big one. But if it's small, really small, then I'll do the single fold. But it's totally up to you. There's nothing wrong with doing a double fold. It's just if you want to get it nice and flat, then go for the single fold. Okay, how is it done? Let me look at some questions real quick. Lisa said she's never used a clapper, just didn't know how that works. Lisa, was I able to explain that well enough? When you iron it and then you just place that on top. Okay, that's all it is. All right. Yeah. Can I show the two next to each other? Yes. Double fold, single fold. It definitely is much thinner, flatter, and not as wide. Okay, how's it done? Well, let's use this as my example. Oh my gosh, you guys, I'm going to go overtime today. Maybe I should save this for tomorrow. I didn't realize the time. Holy cow. All right, let's do this. We'll try and do this quickly. Okay, so let's bring this down here. Let me get my cord out of the way here. And I'm just going to trim this up real quick. So we're preparing our quilt the same way as we would do when we're doing any kind of regular binding. All right. So we're just trimming everything to be even. There we go. Isn't that going to be cute? And then this is where I like to, my binding is going to be 1 1/4 inches. Okay, so write that down. 1 1/4 inches is how wide as the binding is going to be. So unlike double fold, we're not going to fold this in half. We're just going to keep it like that. So I'm going to take it right here to one side, and I'm going to put right sides together and stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. All right, let's see how fast we can do this. All right, let me move my chair over here. Whoops. Turn on my machine. Oh, I've got to put my needle plate back on. Hold on. Here we go. You always take your needle plate on and off when the machine is off. All right. Shoot. Grab my foot. All right. Put this on. Sewing. Oh, here we go. Sewing. So I am stitching this binding on just like I normally would, with the only exception is that I'm not folding it. All right. Let me get my 1/4 inch seam allowance. There we go. Here we go. So come down a little bit. All right. When I get a 1/4 inch to the corner, I'm going to pivot and go at a diagonal off of the corner. I'm going to fold this back on itself. So this tutorial isn't necessarily about doing the mitered corners, so I'm not going to take time to show that, but I do have some other videos on that. Okay, to the corner, well, close to the corner, 1/4 inch to the corner, pivot, needles down, go sew off to the diagonal, bring it up, and then bring it back down on itself. I want to get to the point where we finish these ends, because this is a little different. Okay, here we go. Cut my threads. All right, one more to go. Okay, I'm on my last seam. So I bring this up and around again, and we'll go from there. I just sew a little ways into it. All right, let's come back over to the cutting table. Okay, so I have this overlap here. Let's take a look. Okay, so do you see how there's plenty of, I got plenty of binding drifting off in the wind. I'm actually going to, let's see, I'm going to just trim this up a little bit. Okay, so that this part lays flat. Now, if you've done my other binding tutorials for the double fold, you know that I leave one edge nice and flat up against the quilt. I bring the other piece of the binding up and over. And normally what we would do is we would measure from where these two pieces met, where they intersected, we would measure the binding over by that many inches, because that was how we do double fold. When it comes to single fold, it's just a little bit different. All right, I'm going to take a pin here, and I want you to, oh, I hope you can see this okay. Let's see. All right, so this one is face, this is down, nice and flat. This side is coming up and over. Now, where those two intersect, I'm actually going to place a little pin right there where they intersect. Okay, this is where they are about to cross. So I place a pin here. Now I bring this up, and this is the loose end of my binding from the other side. I bring this over to match where the pin is. Pin is right here. I'm going to just bring this right here. Okay. And I will take my pin and pin it up here now. So those two pieces are perpendicular to one another. Then I'm going to just stitch from outside to outside. Okay, outside corner to outside corner, and I'm going to stitch that. All right, so let's run back over here to the machine so I can stitch it. So does everyone see how this one is a little bit different than the double fold? Okay, so again, this looks like that. I'm going to go from outside corner to outside corner. You could draw a line on it if you wanted to. I'm going to eyeball it for sake of time. There we go. Okay, there we go. It's sewn together. Now, before you cut anything, make sure it's done correctly. Yep, that looks good. And so now, grab my scissors. I'm going to just trim this up. Trim that extra. Just do a finger press here. And look, guys, it just goes right into that. See? Just like that. How cool is that? Now I just take it back to the machine and I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down to finish this. Ta-da! And it's done. Yay! So now it's ready to go like that. So let me show you one more thing. Okay. All right. So now all my binding is on the front and I'm going to hand stitch it to the back. How do you hand stitch it to the back when you have a raw edge? You might be wondering, right? No problem. Let's do this. Okay, what we're going to do is all the binding comes out like this. All right. Then I'm going to simply fold this in up to the quilt back. So it's just like a 1/4 inch. And I can press it with an iron. I can finger press it, whatever I want to do there. But do you see how this is just folded on top of itself, but only to the edge of the quilt top or quilt backing? Then that's all you have to do. And then you come up and around and you do your hand stitching, which we talked about last week. Hooray for hand stitching. And you just do the same thing as you did before. That's it. So sometimes we make things too complicated. We overcomplicate these processes. But I mean, really, that was very simple. I hope you felt like it was very simple. And come back to this video if you need to. Maybe I'll make another video and put it in the club for reference, but where it's just this part. But you can see, look how nice and thin that binding is, right? I mean, that's beautiful binding. And on the back, it's beautiful binding. So there we go. That's how you do it. This is how we do it. Can't help myself. All right. And you can see this is what I did here. So I hope this little tutorial helped you learn something new or inspired you to try something different. That's it. That's my story. Hold on. Okay, grab my chair. Whew. Okay. What questions do we have? Sorry, I'm overtime, guys. I'm so sorry. I know, isn't that Christmas fabric so cute? So cute, but it's like, I don't know, like 6, 7 years old. Let's see. Debbie never made a single full binding before, so she'll have to give it a try. Yeah, you might really enjoy it. It's kind of fun. Thinner batting, or thinner binding, thinner biting. All right. So that is that. So in review, real quick, tip 1, choose fabric print smaller in scale. This is if you're going to be doing miniatures, right? Although this is still very helpful no matter what size of quilt you do, any kind of piecing, all these tips can help you with. Starch fabric before cutting. Use smaller rulers and mats. If available, select the single hole or straight stitch needle plate. Choose a 1/4 inch foot. Recheck the 1/4 inch seam allowance often. Shorten your stitch length on the machine. Use leaders and enders if needed. Use a stiletto. Open seams as much as possible. Use a Gypsy Clapper to help achieve flat seams. And number 10, consider using a single full binding to finish.